To be crossing over to the UK. We'll be talking with a UK-based journalist, Muhammad Hussein, about several things. The fresh sanctions being slapped onto Russia by the UK, and then, time permitting, we'll talk about tensions between the Muslim and the Hindu communities out in the UK. But like I say, time permitting, of course. This interview, inshallah, will take us to the top of the hour at 10 o'clock South African time. Let's now cross to you, Muhammad Hussein. Salaam alaikum to you. Welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you on the show. Now, obviously, the UK is talking about further sanctions on Russia because of the atrocities in the Ukraine. They're moving into Ukraine. We're also hearing that they want to get the Russians, obviously, are conscripting civilians to bolster their army to further invade the Ukraine. What are these fresh sanctions going to be doing? What sort of sanctions are we talking about? How is that going to impact on Russia? And obviously, Putin is then going to retaliate in some form or the other. And then the whole world starts reeling. It's either gas, oil, sunflower seeds, etc. And the price here for those commodities have gone through the roof in South Africa. Undoubtedly, your countrymen are also feeling the same impacts we're feeling down south.
Yes, well, the sanctions. As for the sanctions, uh, the they're not meant to have much of an impact, or they won't have an impact as much as the UK or other countries say they will. Um, the sanctions consist of travel bans. They consist of the freezing of assets, any assets that they might have in the UK. So it consists of these things, which won't have a direct effect unless they have, of course, many assets in the UK, or unless they have family or they want to travel to the UK. So, and it's the same for US sanctions. So the sanctions themselves won't have much of a direct impact. And we have seen throughout the past 8 months or so of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Western sanctions on Russian individuals and Russian oligarchs and Russian political figures, we have seen that the sanctions haven't had much of an effect. They have had an effect, like I said, in the freezing of assets, and they have made things hard. And oligarchs have lost some millions, and apparently overall net worth of around 130 or so billion. But it has not stopped their operations. It has not hindered them up to such an extent that they can't operate anymore. So the Russian states and the Russian energy companies and the Russian state-affiliated companies like Gazprom and other ones, they are still operating. They are still able to operate. They are still able to have partnerships and to operate with other countries. So it hasn't hindered them that much. And as for, you mentioned the second point, sorry?
Okay, I'm talking about here in South Africa. As far
Yes,
removed
the prices.
as we are, we feeling the impact of obviously high oil prices, etc. Grain, which we are very dependent on. I think almost the entire African continent is dependent on grain from the Ukraine, and we do know that those shipments have been stopped from going forward. So these are the type of impacts I'm wondering about. And we know, as I have indicated in my opening statement, that Putin will retaliate in some way or form or the other to cause hardship. I think the other fear is, you are a political analyst as well. The other fear is he has been making noises about nuclear weaponry. And that's another huge concern and fear for the entire globe.
Yes, that is. I'll just cover the food prices and the prices of commodities. That's at the beginning of the conflict. That was a huge worry, and I myself wrote about it and I covered it. There was a global food crisis coming to the entire world, but especially the developing countries in Asia, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and Africa. So there was a looming food crisis, and that still remains. And prices have risen even here in the UK, and as you said, in South Africa. That has been partly averted by the Turkish and UN mediation with Ukraine and Russia, which has allowed some grain shipments to leave Ukraine and the Black Sea. So it has been partially eased, but even those shipments we have been seeing are going to Russian allies mainly, or are being diverted to Western countries, to more developed countries. They haven't been making their way as much to developing countries who are not allies of Russia, you could say. So even though the crisis has been eased, it's still there. It is still looming. The war is not over yet. The effects are still there. So we can say that there may be a food crisis, and not just food, like you said, sunflower oil and other commodities and fertilizers in particular. Without fertilizers, uh, enough agriculture cannot be made up to a sufficient extent, you know. And that's is the that's the consequence of the war in Ukraine. That's one of the consequences. But you also mentioned the nuclear threats, and Russia does have that as a backup option, and that's the main fear. If he does lose the war in Ukraine, or if he does incur more significant losses, as we have seen over the past week, they've lost the city of Kharkiv and Kupiansk. They have lost a lot of territory to the Ukrainians, around 3,000 square meters, apparently. So if that continues, and if Ukraine does retake some of the eastern provinces, which Russia has right now, then the fear is that he can use that nuclear option. Now, is he likely to use that? We're not sure. Some people have speculated that he has cancer and he has nothing to lose, and that he will use it. Some people have said that it's just a bluff, but for now we're not sure. But Putin has himself said, I think yesterday, he said that it's not a bluff. He said that it is a real threat. So I guess we have to take him at his word.
Absolutely. And it's very worrying indeed. Let's just look at that scenario. Please God, it doesn't come to that. But should he, go that route, what do you believe the implications will be, not only for Europe? Ukraine obviously is in the direct line, Europe, the UK, and possibly the rest of the world. How's that going to impact?
Well, as
The
soon as
mind
Russia,
boggles. I can't even want to apply my mind to it, but it's a conversation that needs to be had.
course, of course, as soon as Russia sets off some of its nuclear warheads and missiles, then we can expect, or the US and other countries have said that they will retaliate. We can expect that they could retaliate. Like I said, the likelihood of the situation isn't known, but if that does happen, then there will be enormous, enormous destruction. Um,
And
one,
possibly,
one
Mohammed, possibly the start of the Third World War.
Yes, well, that depends on a lot of factors. Like there's a lot of moving factors. But one area that will be greatly affected apparently is even the UK. The western coast, or above Ireland, will be hit. That's what Russian media
Directly.
has said, and that will cause a tsunami wave to cover the entirety of UK and some of Western Europe and other areas in the world as well. And depending on where it's hit in the US, the extent of it depends on the type of nuclear warhead, on the range, etc. But there will be enormous destruction. And as you said, World War III. Well, this is speculation. This it depends on who survives. It depends on which nation is willing to take up arms against that, and which one survives. But this is all future speculation.
But we need to
Unfortunately,
apply
this
our
doesn't
minds
happen.
nonetheless. What's the situation looking like in the UK and obviously in Europe regarding Russians wanting to avoid the draft, because Russian men and boys are being called up to join the army, because obviously Putin wants to bolster up his numbers, indicating he's pretty serious about taking this even further. So are you finding we've seen video footage. We've seen mainstream media showing how people are leaving Russia in their droves. Obviously, he's going to put a stop to it. He's going to close off those borders because quite a number of people have already fled. Are you getting a big influx of people in the UK? Is UK up to dealing with an influx of migrants?
Well, so far, I haven't seen any significant influx of Ukrainian migrants or refugees. I did see them in, for example, in Bosnia and in
Or
Montenegro,
Russians for that
I was.
matter. Russians who are trying to escape the
Oh yes,
blast.
yes. Sorry, Russians. Um, Russians I haven't seen particularly in the UK yet. Not many, and it's it's. I'm skeptical of what kind or what class of Russians can actually make it all the way to the UK with their significant assets, etc. But they might be the upper-class ones or a family of oligarchs, etc. But in Eastern Europe, we have. I did personally see Russians. I did meet some Russians in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In Montenegro, for example, I met some Russian dissidents and young Russian men who were escaping. This was before the draft, even. This was before or like this new ruling. So now we can expect that there in Eastern Europe and other parts and in the Balkans, there are many of them escaping. In the UK, I haven't seen any personally yet. And I haven't received any reports of any influx of them. So I'm afraid I cannot answer that right now.
I know you don't have a crystal ball in front of you, but these are things we do apply our minds to regarding this invasion into the Ukraine. What do if I think the entire world, none of us were expecting it to last this long. It's 6 months into this invasion already, and chances are that Putin is not going to give up anytime soon. Probably a huge crush to his ego more than anything else. But be that as it may, how do you see this playing out? Uh, Hopefully, he doesn't go the nuclear weaponry route. What's it going to take for this man to call a truce and to leave Ukraine and the Russian neighboring states alone to rebuild their lives, rebuild their countries, and to move on?
I've often asked this myself, and I've wondered this myself, to be honest. I think the most likely route that would influence Putin to seize the invasion and to pull back his forces, or to at least halt. I think the most likely route would be negotiations and would be talks with mediators. So we see, for example, the Turks are having serious mediation efforts to mediate between Ukraine and Russia, and to try and make some kind of deal, to try and make a ceasefire. And while it seemed like it was working a few months ago, I think it was 2 months into the invasion, 2 or 3 months, while it seemed that there was some progress, that obviously fell apart and is continuing. There has been progress on some fronts. So we see in Azovstal steel plants in southern Ukraine, Ukraine did mediate to for the transport and for the escape and for the evacuation of some Ukrainian soldiers and other people. So there has been some success on some fronts of negotiation. But as for the conflict itself, there isn't any progress. But I think that would be the most likely way that Putin would be influenced to stop the invasion, or to halt it at least. Some people say that at this moment it's a pride issue, it's an ego issue, that Putin and the Russian government cannot just seize after all of that effort, after everything that's happened. And I think that's true. But obviously, if there are mediation efforts, and if there is some clout that both sides can have, if the Ukrainian side can make a deal with the Russian side, and both of them have some gain from mediation, and if they come to an agreement, then I think that's the most likely way that they can be halted, at least. As for long term,
Carry on.
As for years ahead, that's yet to be seen.
Inshallah, common sense does prevail, and we can have a truce in that part of the world. Um, as a political analyst, and I am cognizant of the fact that as far as Russian news is concerned, there is, as has always been in the past, lots of propaganda and lots of blackout of negative news on Russia and its people. But have we an understanding at all as to what's the people on the ground feeling like? What's the situation in Russia? Are they also being impacted economically and otherwise by this war on the Ukraine?
Well, Russia, in fact, largely prepared for this. They largely prepared economically for the consequences of sanctions and for the consequences of any economic backlash. So they have their own payment systems. For example, when they were cut off from the SWIFT payment system and the MasterCard and Visa payment systems, they fell back on their own Mira payment system, and I think they have another one. So they have their own kind of banking system and payment system and the electronic finance system that they fell back on, and they operate quite well on. They're not suffering much as a consequence. As for the average Russian, there has been, from what I've heard, of course, there has been some effects. Like everyone in the war, there has been some impact on their finances, etc. But they have their own payment system and they're operating well on it. So that's the situation.
Okay. Muhammad Hussein, a journalist based in the UK and a political analyst. That's all we have time for. We can't even touch on the other issue I did want to touch on, and that is tensions between the Muslim and Hindu communities in the UK. But let's leave that for another time, inshallah. Really great talking with you this morning, and you go well till the next time. As always, Assalamu alaikum to you.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of the show for this morning. Thank you indeed for your company. It is 2 minutes after 10 o'clock. Till tomorrow morning at the same time. As always, a very big thank you to my producer, Nasreen Naidu, who's holding the fort for the second hour on her own. Well done, my dear girl. And to all of you, the rest of you out there, pretty hot out there today. So make sure that you are adequately hydrated. Sunscreen and sun hats and sun caps to protect yourself. Till tomorrow morning at the same time, take care on the roads. Assalamu alaikum and Khudafiz from me, Julie Ali. But do stand by for Juz number 30 by Sheikh Ahmed Ajmi. Wassalam.